Welcome to our extended discussion on including students with autism in general education. This discussion began as a town hall meeting at the Council for Exceptional Children's 2010 Convention and Expo in Nashville. This 20-minute podcast condenses presentations by Craig Kennedy, Mark Wolery, and Carolyn Hughes of Vanderbilt University, and Debra Kamps of the University of Kansas. The town hall format was new to the CEC convention in 2010. These events gave experts in the field the opportunity to offer multiple perspectives on a particular topic, while giving the audience the chance to respond to points made by the presenters, pose questions that extended the perspectives, and hear answers from the experts and each other. This condensed discussion offers you the chance to respond to these presenters as well. CEC will use your comments to inform our future work. The podcast opens with Dr. Kennedy and then proceeds to Dr. Wolery, Dr. Kamps, and Dr. Hughes. Enjoy.
Welcome, everybody. We're pleased to see so many people turn out for this town hall. My name is Craig Kennedy. I'm on the faculty at Peabody College at Vanderbilt University, and I'm organizing this session, where we'll be talking about inclusive education for students with autism in general education settings.
Thank you, Craig. I want to make 5 assumptions about inclusive early childhood services for young kids with autism. And I'm going to use autism, but I'm talking about the spectrum. First assumption is that by definition, young kids with autism have communication and social impairments, which we need to take into account when we're teaching them. We have a whole variety of models, and there's any number of descriptions of those models for providing services at the early childhood level. Many of them are not inclusive. Some of them are, as you well know, strictly in the home. But some of them are inclusive. And the third thing is that inclusive approaches can provide opportunities for learning some key social and communicative skills. Fourth assumption I make is that we know pretty well what the content of the curriculum ought to be for young kids with autism. It ought to look at engagement and attention, including joint attention. It ought to look at imitation. It ought to look at social skills. It ought to look at communication. It also ought to look at some being in the community skills and some adaptive skills. And fortunately, we have, at least at the literature level, a relatively large arsenal of intervention strategies. So we may not know how to teach each child well or quickly or efficiently, but we know pretty much how to teach most kids with autism most of the skills they need to learn. So we have evidence-based practices that have ecological validity, meaning that they've been studied in the context of inclusive early childhood programs and are feasible to do there. Now, the database conclusions I want to make. One is that being there is not sufficient. So being in a really good, rich, high-quality, inclusive program isn't sufficient for young kids with autism to learn a great deal. Some intervention, I would prefer, some instruction is going to be necessary. Second is that the social and communicative behaviors require pretty precise intervention. So it isn't just any old intervention. And it probably needs to be supplemented by dozens of opportunities throughout the day. And that, of course, requires some careful monitoring. Third statement I think that we can support without much question is this notion that peer-related social, communicative, and play behavior probably starts with proximity and supported exchanges. Fourth is that the reinforcement-based procedures and the transfer of stimulus control procedures that we've had around for a long, long time probably are still pretty necessary. They need to be clearly a part of the repertoire of educators who are working with young kids with autism. Final thing deals with what the staff need in a good inclusive program. They need reasonable child-to-staff ratios. They need adequate space and equipment. They need some orientation and preparation. But what they need most, and I'm convinced is most lacking in most programs or most classrooms, most districts, is ongoing access to expertise.
How do you define reasonable child-to-staff ratio? Do you have any recommendations for what that would look like?
It would change a bit by age, but if you're dealing with 2s and 3s, let's say a 1-to-3 ratio, and if you're dealing with 4s, maybe you can get by with 1-to-4 or 1-to-5. Generally better to have more kids and more staff than have fewer kids and fewer staff. So 6 kids and 2 adults is not as good as 9 kids and 3 adults, because the way you can manage the staffing plan within the classroom.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to really confirm some of Mark's comments and give you my perspective on inclusion, which is from a social perspective. Almost all of my work has been centered around inclusion in small groups with peers. And so peer-mediated interventions, I'm talking about what I know best, and those strategies are now presented as evidence-based practice by the National Research Council and by the recently published National Standards Project. Appreciate the value of peers. And I believe that peers truly provide very naturally occurring social opportunities, but they're also really good teachers. When I talk about peer-mediated interventions, I'm really speaking about, I call them peer networks. We typically do play groups, we do peer tutoring, we do recess, and we do lunch bunch. And we recommend, in elementary schools, we recommend that every child with autism has these 4 peer networks. And also, here's what we found in terms of generalization, which is really important, as you know, is that we recommend that each one of these peer networks occurs at least 3 times a week. And some of these can be short, maybe 10 minutes in duration, but that's to build on and to expect the generalization. That's what you need. In elementary schools, think about what behaviors people, or what's the criteria for children being included in gen ed classes. 3 biggies. One's the behavior, right, of the child. How is his behavior? And how is that child's academic functioning? And then the resources in the school. It isn't just about how children behave or how they act in classrooms, it's how they interact with people around them. Peers will affect the behavior of children with autism. It's our job to make sure that they do that in an appropriate way, and that they don't inadvertently reinforce inappropriate behaviors, and that they don't ignore some of those desirable behaviors that we're trying to teach. Also, there have been so many studies now that have shown that exposure alone, including children in classrooms without any kind of teaching, any kind of network instruction, any kind of training for the peers, it isn't going to necessarily promote interactions to occur, and it isn't necessarily going to promote positive attitudes. Peer networks and interventions for children with autism, when you use a peer-mediated approach, it isn't just about changing the behavior of children with autism. Truly, you are changing the behavior and the attitudes of those peers. You know, in terms of the social validity, it is about what the peers are learning too, and how we're improving those attitudes.
Will you talk a little bit about how you train the peers, and how, like, when you first start with them, before you get to that second part of asking the questions, how you originally trained them to work with the kids, and how you deal with the confidentiality aspect of giving them the information that they need to know about the peer that they're going to be working with without giving them too much information?
Right. Well, there are a lot of questions in that question, but I will say that for children that we are following, we secure parent consent for all the peers who are involved, and teachers help us recruit those peers. And we, in terms of confidentiality, I would say that the way that we address that is just by setting an example of how we talk with the child and how we interact with the child and how we talk and plan our group. We give very specific information depending on the child. Sometimes we do an initial maybe week or so where we bring the peers together without the child with autism, but that's the exception rather than the rule. And it does really depend on the child, but even though the information may be too difficult for the child with autism to understand, it's okay to have them with the peers and with the group from day one. And so that's my most preferred method. And so we're training them in terms of the content. We are teaching, there are 4 kind of basic things that we teach, and they are how to give simple instructions. So they're not like 3-sentence long instructions, how to give simple instructions, what to say if you see an aberrant behavior, and we like to teach kids to say what you want to see instead of no, no, no. And we teach them about how to prompt and how to do, depending on the child. So we might teach some very gentle physical guidance, but we also teach them to wait, count to 3 to see if the child's going to respond before you start giving prompts. So how to be reinforcing and positive. So those are the kind of the basic peer skills that we teach. Somebody asked about the ratio, and I like to have in the small groups 3 typical peers for the child with autism. And so that way we can do some partners, pairs, so we can greatly increase the opportunities to practice.
The other thing was you were talking about doing the groups and the game groups and stuff like 3 times a week. Mm-hmm. So this is during school, right?
Yes.
Okay, so how do you convince, how do you get around with everybody saying we got to do academics all the time?
Right. Well, that's hard. I'm not going to pretend that it isn't hard, but the way that we manage it in some settings is we rotate peers. So some teachers will have the same group of peers in the network for a month, and then we'll switch out. The other way that we manage that is we have multiple classes involved in contributing peers to the network. And then a third way, and teachers really like this, and I'm a big proponent of it, is that we make that peer network address some academic skills as well. So I'm a big advocate of peer tutoring groups and cooperative learning groups, because then we can have some academic content interspersed with some of the social skills that we're working on. You can teach encouraging, you can teach reinforcing behavior, you can teach helping within an academic peer group.
I really like how Craig arranged this session, that we're going from preschool to elementary, now high school. And so I challenge you as I speak here now, and you think of your questions, look at the similarities and the differences you see across the ages as we go. Now we are starting to get a literature base which indicates across many studies, many different kinds of methodologies, that yes, indeed, peer interaction does produce many great effects, even in post-school outcomes as far as being employed, going on to post-secondary ed, etc., for special ed kids and as well for general ed kids as far as their self-esteem, what they report about building friendships with kids with disabilities, etc. Unfortunately, though, we see that there is very little inclusion of students with severe disabilities and severe autism in school. The majority of kids falling into those categories spend the majority of their day outside the general ed classroom. And this is increasingly so as kids move from elementary into high school, and it's increasingly so for kids who are black or brown. They are more segregated in schools. What we have also found looking across all these high schools that there is very little programming or prompting of social interaction that occurs between kids with disabilities and their peers. Just like Mark said, intervention is necessary or it's not going to happen. So I'm going to repeat exactly what the previous speaker said. Proximity is not enough, as we already know from many, many studies in the past. When we get into high school, we have a whole different kind of situation than we're talking about preschool and elementary. Those of you who have been in a high school lately. There's chaos going on. There are multiple schedules, class schedule, departmentalized courses, conflicting events. There's also the cool factor. And we have spent a lot of time before introducing any sort of intervention in asking people, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about interacting with your peers, etc., both special ed kids, general ed kids, teachers, paras, etc. And it might surprise you to know that general ed high school students have a lot of fear and trepidation about interacting with the kid with disabilities. I don't know how to do that. I don't know what to expect. The problem is then that we have little opportunity to learn appropriate social skills. We're in proximity, there's no support going on, etc. General ed kids are saying, we need help too. We need help to know how to interact. We talk to parents who say, this is our last chance. We know they're going out into the work environment. Employment does not put up with the stuff that you can get away with in a self-contained special ed classroom. I mean, you have to sort of toe the line, and parents know this. And they're all for having, let's start looking right away. I am totally sold on a two-pronged model. One being that we need to increase people's competence. We need to teach social interaction skills to kids with disabilities. The other side of this coin is that we need to have a supportive environment to maintain those behaviors. I actually want to show you a little study that we're doing right now. We have 5 students with autism and intellectual disabilities. This is kind of sort of at the lower end of the spectrum, who are in a general ed setting and a pretty inclusive high school, I have to say, for our particular district. And we have many more peers involved than we do special ed kids. We use direct instruction to teach kids, in this case, to use a booklet. It could be something else. It could be some other way for them to start an interaction, etc. We go through a sequence here, and we ask general ed teachers, who do you think might be good to interact with so-and-so? So this goes back to the questions that some of you were asking before. Well, how do you identify these peers who are going to be good at helping to support and promote social interaction among the kids with autism and intellectual disabilities and so forth? They have a great sense about what will work, and in many cases put these guys together, etc. So we're actually in general ed classes. We teach only socially validated ways to start conversations, because we've hung out in high schools a lot. How do you start a conversation with a high school kid? Don't talk about the weather. That's just not a cool topic. It's, do you drive? You drive to school today? Can I get a ride with you? And, music, stuff like that. We see interaction is occurring. And peers feel good about it. They're smiling. I got sort of reinforced myself early on in this little study. Early on in the semester, I was walking by 2 kids who had just had an interaction, and then the general ed peer had a big smile on his face. And he said, wow, that was just like the kind of conversation I have with some of my friends. And I felt like he had a lot of ownership of this, that he was able to see that he had an effect on his partner there.
You said you have to support the peers,
right?
And I've seen in elementary schools you teach the peers and they're fine. In high school, a peer volunteers and then gets flack from their friends. How do you handle that kind of what kinds of typical peer support do you build in?
There, I would say many different kinds, and it depends on what kind of situation it is. In the past, well, actually, we had a peer buddy program throughout all these 11 different comprehensive high schools in Nashville. And actually, I have a whole book on how to run a peer buddy program that goes through all of this. It goes through how to support peers, etc., how to set the whole thing up. I think one thing that's really important is that peers have a chance to get together with each other. Because if they're in a situation over here, I'm in keyboarding, I'm the only one who's providing support in this situation, somebody else is over there, to give them a chance to get together and to talk about stuff. Because sometimes it's a little confusing and what's going on. I think that's a big help there.
Thank you for your interest in this discussion about the inclusion of students with autism in general education settings. CEC encourages you to share this content with your colleagues and respond to it via YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. You can also share your thoughts by emailing us at service@cec.sped.org with the subject line Autism Podcast. We look forward to exploring this topic further at the CEC 2011 Convention and Expo, April 25th to 28th in National Harbor, Maryland. We hope you will join us. To register, visit our website at www.cec.sped.org.